All right, so is there a God is what we were talking about last week. And of course, yes, there is. And we're going to start with a song because, again, I think songs kind of put you in the right mood. And this is Phil Wickham's version of Amazing Grace. It's always a good start. So I wanted to just kind of give us an update on our progress on the class. So we did truth and we're finishing up, is there a God? So we're kind of building toward our evidence for God, this whole series. And then next week we will talk, I think we're going to actually skip and do the problem of evil next week. And then we'll go back and do the evidence for why we can actually trust and believe what we see in the Bible. And there's a lot of great evidence. But the problem of evil is the one that everybody always uses against Christianity. That's the atheist hammer is what I like to call it. And we will talk through their arguments and then show why their arguments really actually point toward God instead of away from God. It's not to downplay bad things that happen in this world, because bad things happen. But the Bible gives us some guidance on how to address those things. And it definitely will be interesting conversation, because that is one that most people struggle with the most. And I'm sure, Eric, you've seen the worst of the worst, and how you deal with those things really do impact how we can trust that God really does exist and that He has a plan. So it's just kind of give you an overview, because I know Chris asked me last week, it's like, where are we in our sequence? And I'll try to do that. We're going to be talking mostly about science today, which I'll get excited about. But when we get to the end, we'll have a couple of sessions where we're going to just talk about science in the Bible. And, sorry, no, that's okay. It happens to me all the time. All right. So we're going to be talking mostly about naturalism versus God. And we talked about the cumulative case a little bit last week, and that most of the evidence leans toward God. But the naturalist thinks that everything happens if you have enough time. So I think I brought this out a couple weeks ago. This is a paperweight. I don't know if you can see that Judy and I's faces are etched into this glass. It was given to us as a wedding gift. It has our anniversary on it. So let me ask you a question. How long do you think it would take that to become that? That's really what the naturalist is saying. If you wait long enough, things will become more ordered, more designed. What's the difference between these two items? They're both highly designed, right? They're both made out of glass. What's the difference? There's a higher level of design in the paperweight, right? Now, I could break this on the floor and take a blowtorch to it. Would that help me get toward that? No. Probably not. And, the naturalist approach is really more like this. Let's see if I can get my example out without setting the house on fire. So, the naturalist says if you just heat sand, you're going to have that paperweight. I think I can do this, actually. Let's see if I can do it. So fire. I'm not going to really do it. But they think lightning or whatever, and I can make that look like that. Highly designed. Is that practical? No. And in fact, the naturalist view is even more complicated. They say, despite all the junk that you might have in creation, somehow I can take this very disorganized mess, let me pick it up, and somehow, just with time, it's going to become ordered. And I think we all know from our experience that time usually doesn't help things to get more ordered. Usually it gets less ordered. And there's probably some moisture in here, and if I was to set this out in the sun for a few days and come back, it probably wouldn't smell very good. But that's what we're up against when we're looking at the naturalist views of things, is they think in the case of life that the universe moved from chaos to order, even though what we observe here on Earth is always the opposite of that. So it's something to keep in mind that their theories, they have that roadblock in their mind. They have this concept that everything in the origins is opposite to what we observe. Go ahead, Eric.
Are you talking about Scientology in a sense?
Well, Scientology is actually another religion, but that would be, which Christian scientists might be the ones that kind of think this way, but a naturalist is the one that thinks everything comes from essentially nothing, right? Or we started with very simple and we became really complex. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the different levels of creation and see how we can see design in those different levels. So we're going to be looking at our puzzle, and we'll be focusing here on these two puzzle pieces. Proof for God, but we're going to actually prove God through science. So let me just kind of recap where we were last week. The first thing, 2 books, because I try to recommend books every week. William Lane Craig's Cosmological Argument. If you're looking for better information than what I gave you on the cosmological argument, William Lane Craig's book is pretty good. It's a whole book. I gave you 5 minutes. He gives you a whole book. He actually teaches a class at Biola just on this subject. Another one would be if the ontological argument, which was the argument of being, which was the one that hurt your head because it's all about philosophy. Norman Geisler wrote a whole book on that theory, and he puts it in language that's a little easier to understand than maybe what I did. So if you're interested in either one of those arguments, these would be resources to get a little more depth on those 2 topics. Teleological, now that's one we're going to talk about today, which is the one of design. So, is there a God? And you guys are completely quiet.
Yes.
Yes. But the question is why? Why do we think there's a God? And that's the reason we're having these sessions to talk about. There's lots of evidence for God. And in fact, Christianity is not a blind faith. We have a faith that's actually supported by the evidence. It's supported by science, it's supported by logic, it's supported by reason, it's supported by everything. Anybody that says things point away from God is not being, they're being ingenuous about the way they're describing certain aspects of their arguments. And I believe in the cumulative case approach pretty much to everything. I'm a scientist, that's what we do. It's like the teeter-totter I have down here. When you decided to come over here, you had to weigh which direction you were going to go. Well, that's the cumulative case approach. You think, how long it's going to take me, how far it's going to take me, what the traffic might be. Maybe there's something you like to look at when you're driving. Well, those are all things that you use as evidence to choose your path. I mean, everything we do in life effectively follows the cumulative case approach. And the question I have for Christians is, why don't we use this in our defense of Christianity? Because it's very strong. The evidence against Jesus is much weaker than the evidence for Jesus. Instead of dwelling on trying to disprove every little thing, why don't you show the volume of proof for what we believe? Sometimes we get too pessimistic and we get too focused on trying to counter somebody's false claims that you can get lost in the weeds. What I would suggest is to stick with the claims that are really strong, and then once we've established the breadth of our evidence, then we can talk about how we would address their biggest concerns. And we talked a little bit about it last week about how much evidence we have. And this is not a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. We talked about the beginnings argument, which is the cosmological argument. That's the beginning of everything. Usually comes back to Big Bang. We'll talk about the design argument today, the moral argument, how do we choose right and wrong, what they call the being argument, which is ontological. It means our essence of existence. It's a philosophical argument, always points toward God. We talked about what the standard is for truth. And in part of that session, we talked about also what the standard is for beauty, aesthetics. Aesthetics are something that just kind of come natural to us. And the question is, where does that come from? The naturalist perspective doesn't work because there's no basis for things being pretty or things tasting good. I mean, none of those concepts make sense in a naturalist perspective. That has to be something that is outside of us where we get those concepts. And those are things that we have already kind of addressed. And let me just go through it kind of quickly, just kind of recap, because I know some of you weren't here last week. So when we're talking about the cosmological argument, we're talking about the big one, right? That where everything came from. And there's basically 5 main arguments, and we went through them last week. The Big Bang, the balanced universe, the cyclic, it's an expanding, contracting universe, the redefined time model, which is a little weird, and then the multiverse. And we went through why those failed when you looked at the evidence last week. So if you want more on that, we can talk about it again. But it got us to the point where most physicists, most scientists agree that there had to have been a beginning. And that always gets us to the Big Bang, is what they call it. And as Christians, we always have the comeback, is if there is a Big Bang, then there's got to be a Big Bang-er, right? You can't have everything come from nothing unless there is something very powerful that has made that take place. So that's the cosmological argument in a 30-second nutshell. The other one was the right and wrong, and this is the moral argument. There has to be a basis for our standard for right and wrong. It's not intuitive that it would be, well, human flourishing is the one that's often used as the argument, that right and wrong is really determined what's best for the society. But it's actually not true. If you look at world governments in history, people try to do human flourishing their way. Hitler was trying to do human flourishing when he was trying to eliminate all the weak. Stalin tried to do the same thing. You can go through all the human efforts to make human flourishing work, and it doesn't look very pretty. The standard has to be outside of humans, because who gets to make the choice on what human flourishing looks like? Our selfish nature always means it's going to look like me or what I want. It's never going to look like what God wants, which is, so there has to be a standard. So that's just kind of quickly going through what we did last week. And if you have any questions about that, we can talk about it in more detail. But I wanted to spend time just on the design argument. Teleo means design, so teleological just means the study of design. And I'm going to use, I don't know how, I introduced you to J. Warner Wallace a few weeks ago. He's one of the Christian apologists that's written a bunch of books. He used to be a cold case detective in Los Angeles. So he kind of takes that approach to his defense of Christianity. And he has this idea that you need to look at every level of creation. And I kind of took that and expanded on it a little bit. So our target is our design argument. And the outer level is going to be the universe level. We're going to look at everything on the grand level. Then we'll come down to the galactic level, just looking at our galaxy, the Milky Way. Then we'll look at our regional level, which is our solar system. And then our local level, which is the planet Earth. Then we'll get to a personal level, which is life itself. And then we'll go to subatomics, and I'll start smiling because that's my scientific research, right? So I get a chance to share some of my words that are not in the normal vernacular. But we'll look at each one of these, and what you'll see is that God's design is very evident at every level of creation. And the question is, if it's not God, then what is it? I mean, how can you see complexity in design and think it just came from nothing? It's like the paperweight coming from a pile of sand. If I just waited 1 billion years, it would turn into this highly designed paperweight. And trust me, you are way more complicated than that paperweight is. And even our planet, we kind of overlook the complexity of the place we live. And we'll go through each one of those layers. Do you have any questions?
No, but just like that little plate of sand and rocks, the rocks had to come from somewhere. They didn't just appear, and neither did the sand.
Yep.
But it's hard to think about putting that in a human form comes out with all the complexities that we have coming out of that.
Yeah, that's the origin of life research in a nutshell. You have this pool, or right now they're saying it's like basalt glass, and that somehow the proteins got formed on that because it got hit by lightning. And yeah, it's an interesting story. It takes a lot of faith to believe those stories. But we'll just look at it, and like I said, look at the evidence and see if you can see things that you can use. And so we'll look at the galaxy first. And too bad Hank's not here. I have pictures for him. So this is a picture from the James Webb telescope. And this is one of the deepest peers into the universe so far that they've published. In fact, this is in a part of the sky where they thought there was nothing. And they zoomed into, there's places in the sky that looks like it's void of stars. And as they zoomed in, they found more galaxies than you can count. Anything that doesn't have the star pattern on it is a galaxy. So that's like trillions of stars in a place where they didn't think there was anything. The astrophysicists are a little confused about what they see, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So I'm going to just show you a quick video. This is a zoom in. And these are on space.com. You can go see these. This is U.S. government's website. Yeah, they call it a cartwheel galaxy. But I want you to notice how crisp the lights are. Have you ever stood at like 100 meters and shown a flashlight? Does it look small or big relative to its actual size? Light tends to diffuse, right? Everything you see in this image is not what the scientists expected to see. As you zoom in further and further, the galaxies should get blurrier and blurrier. And you'll see, I'll show you a couple more of these as we go on. It's, yeah, color. Now, these are not like pure visual images. These are in a spectrum that we don't see. So what they do is they assign a wavelength of color. So the colors are not what we would see with our naked eye, but what color tells you is direction and speed mostly. So if it's blue, it's kind of coming toward you. If it's red, it's moving away from you.
From galaxies and stars, down to atoms and subatomic particles, the very structure of our universe is determined by these numbers. These are the fundamental constants and quantities of the universe. Scientists have come to the shocking realization that each of these numbers has been carefully dialed to an astonishingly precise value, a value that falls within an exceedingly narrow, life-permitting range. If any one of these numbers were altered by even a hair's breadth, no physical, interactive life of any kind could exist anywhere. There'd be no stars, no life, no planets, no chemistry. Consider gravity, for example. The force of gravity is determined by the gravitational constant. If this constant varied by just 1 in 10 to the 60th parts, none of us would exist. To understand how exceedingly narrow this life-permitting range is, imagine a dial divided into 10 to the 60th increments. To get a handle on how many tiny points on the dial this is, compare it to the number of cells in your body, or the number of seconds that have ticked by since time began. If the gravitational constant had been out of tune by just one of these infinitesimally small increments, the universe would either have expanded and thinned out so rapidly that no stars could form and life couldn't exist, Or it would have collapsed back on itself with the same result: no stars, no planets, and no life. Or consider the expansion rate of the universe. This is driven by the cosmological constant. A change in its value by a mere 1 part in 10 to the 120th parts would cause the universe to expand too rapidly or too slowly. In either case, the universe would, again, be life-prohibiting. Or, another example of fine-tuning. If the mass and energy of the early universe were not evenly distributed to an incomprehensible precision of 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd, the universe would be hostile to life of any kind. The fact is, our universe permits physical, interactive life only because these, and many other numbers, have been independently and exquisitely balanced on a razor's edge. Wherever physicists look, they see examples of fine-tuning. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. If anyone claims not to be surprised by the special features that the universe has, he's hiding his head in the sand. These special features are surprising and unlikely. What is the best explanation for this astounding phenomenon? There are 3 live options. The fine-tuning of the universe is due to either physical necessity, chance, or design. Which of these options is the most plausible? According to this alternative, the universe must be life-permitting. The precise values of these constants and quantities could not be otherwise. But is this plausible? Is a life-prohibiting universe impossible? Far from it. It's not only possible, it's far more likely than a life-permitting universe. The constants and quantities are not determined by the laws of nature. There's no reason or evidence to suggest that fine-tuning is necessary. How about chance? Did we just get really, 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 really lucky? No. The probabilities involved are so ridiculously remote as to put the fine-tuning well beyond the reach of chance. So, in an effort to keep this option alive, some have gone beyond empirical science and opted for a more speculative approach, known as the multiverse. They imagine a universe generator that cranks out such a vast number of universes that, odds are, life-permitting universes will eventually pop out. However, there's no scientific evidence for the existence of this multiverse. It cannot be detected, observed, measured, or proved. And the universe generator itself would require an enormous amount of fine-tuning. Furthermore, small patches of order are far more probable than big ones. So the most probable, observable universe would be a small one, inhabited by a single, simple observer. But what we actually observe is the very thing that we should least expect: a vast, spectacularly complex, highly ordered universe, inhabited by billions of other observers. So even if the multiverse existed, which is a moot point, it wouldn't do anything to explain the fine-tuning. Given the implausibility of physical necessity or chance, the best explanation for why the universe is fine-tuned for life may very well be it was designed that way. A common-sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a superintellect monkeyed with physics, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. There is for me powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day they pour forth speech. Night after night they reveal knowledge.
So that's reasonable faith. That's William Lane Craig's ministry. And all the people he's quoting are all atheists. So those people that were quoting that must be something behind the design, they all don't believe in God, believe it or not. So let's just take a closer look at these fine-tuned arguments. And I know this is math, and not everybody loves math like I do, but these are big numbers. And I'll try to put it in perspective in a moment. You know, the gravitational constant, 10 to the 60. I mean, what's 10 to the 60? It's like a crazy, crazy number. That's infinity to most of us. You know, electromagnetic force constant, the cosmological constant, the mass density of the universe, the expansion rate of the universe, which is actually the rate in which the stars are moving apart, initial entropy, which is how much disorder there was at the very beginning, and then all these other minor ones. There's actually more than 120 different universal constants that have been identified so far by science, that if they were different, everything that we have would be, our existence would be different. Chances are there would be no chance for life. So it's a lot of probabilities, and they all have to be exactly the way they are for us to have life here on Earth. So let's take another quick look at the universe. This is the Webb telescope. And scientists, that's the Big Dipper, by the way. And as it zooms in, I want you just to think about the arguments that Craig just talked about. Is chance, is necessity, or is design the most probable? And I know, as I've read a lot of the scientists trying to evaluate what they see, they're starting to question their opinions of time, their opinions of origin. They're starting to think matter might not be real. These are really smart people, because things are so complex and so specifically fine-tuned that their scientific intellect is telling them that there has to be an explanation beyond what we see. So now they're starting to question even their science. I know some people don't even believe that gravity is real anymore by what they see, because these images are just amazing. So that's just a little bit of a taste. And tell Hank I put the extra pictures in here just for him. But I think the difference is, as a Christian, our worldviews are not shaken as science discovers more and more. And that's one thing I want to reinforce, is science actually supports what we believe. Science usually overturns what the scientists believe. Over time, their opinion, tends to fail in some aspect. I mean, Einstein's theory of relativity, well, we found that it doesn't work in some cases. Well, he was human. He didn't understand the whole picture, even though he's a really smart human. So I guess the newsflash for us is that there's a reason it's complex. One thing, it's meant to stimulate our brains. I think God made all this vastness of the cosmos so we never fully understand. And it takes a pretty amazing intellectual mind to imagine what it is we see in just this little corner of the sky. Go ahead.
Time is their big thing. So how do they get past the idea that all of these things have to be there at the same time, or it doesn't work?
Yeah, there's no way to do it in a sequence.
You can't do it.
Well, I know the one thing with time that scientists are struggling with right now is what they see kind of destroys their idea of long universe. Because why do I still see so many stars? Wouldn't they have burned out long ago? So they've come up with all these very imaginative theories on how stars come back. We'll save that for a sci-fi session sometime. But I mean, we still have all these stars. If really we're billions and billions of years old, there should be less instead of more. And their idea of light is you can see light from so far away now that it almost has to have been there at the origin of the universe, which means the universe had to get to a certain stage quicker than the expansion rate, in a way that basically it's like there was nothing, all of a sudden there's something like this. The in-between doesn't appear to exist. And that's, well, it's shaking the foundations of astrophysics, because if there seems to be a gap, that almost means like everything just kind of flashed into existence and then started from a point that wasn't a singularity. And if it's not a singularity, now your Big Bang is more complex, right? So, like I said, the more they look at, the more confused they appear to be getting. So let's talk probabilities. This is actually what I do for a living. I do probabilities. A human in my business is what we would call 10 to the 1. That's about, if you're in a low stress environment and you're doing something you do routinely, there is a 1 chance in 10 that you're going to make a mistake at that task. And that's not very good. Humans aren't very reliable. We build our chemical plants to about 10 to the 4. That's about an event every 1,000 years. We're willing to, we build our protective systems to that type of order magnitude. We're talking about 10 to the 60 when we're talking about these gravitational constants. Like a nuclear plant, roughly 10 to the 7. That's how reliable we want the equipment to be so we don't have nuclear meltdowns. So these are very reliable systems. So when we start talking about numbers that are way, way bigger than this, it starts going past plausible to what we say in science. I have a really technical term for these probabilities. It's called impossible, right? So gravitational force, just to give you an idea what 10 to the 60 looks like, it's 1 trillion and then 50 more zeros. I mean, I don't know. I'm a number guy, but I can't put my head around a number that's that big.
So the 10 to 60 means that the error.
If it was that, that's the sensitivity of the number. If it was off by that sensitivity, yeah. So it's like, it's a number that you can't comprehend. If it's that much off, it's just so precise. Precise is the right term. And I grew up with this game, Yahtzee. Anybody ever play Yahtzee? It's
I play it with my husband because he's concentrating on the numbers and winning. Me, I just play for fun.
See, I'm going to give you the numbers, right? So Yahtzee, a 6-sided dice, you have a 1 in 6 chance that a 6 is going to come up, right? 2, well, they multiply, right? 1 in 6. 1 in 6 is 1 in 36 chance that you would get 2. You do 6 of them, it's about a 1 in 46,000, which is roughly a 10 to the 5 type of number. So when you start talking about rolling 10 6s, it's a lot. We're talking about 10 to the 60 with gravitational. It's like a truckload, all coming up 6s simultaneously. And just give you an idea. I mean, like I said, my scientific term for it is impossible, right? You can calculate a probability that makes it completely improbable that it would take place. So at the universe level, at least, the fine-tuning, the exactness of all these components that we take for granted. Science wouldn't even work if we didn't have these things. To be able to actually do science, it has to be so detailed and so precisely tuned. So at the universe level, at least, it looks like there has to be a mind behind the detail. That's what all these atheists were saying, effectively. There's some power, that's what they always say. There's some power that seems like it fudged the numbers to get to this place. And they won't come out and say, it's like, okay, that's God, okay, it's God, but they at least get to that point where they recognize there's something that it's so precise that you can't explain it. So let's take the next step back. Let's look at the galactic level. And this is, I think, what's this galaxy called? This is M101. They do alphanumeric because there's just too many of them, right? They started naming them when they first put up Hubble, and they quit that after about a year. It's just, you can't keep up with it. And this is effectively what the Milky Way, our galaxy, is supposed to look like. And our galaxy is exactly the right shape, size, and density as far as how many stars there are. We have exactly the right number of stars. Each star is the right size. The stars are all the right intensity to allow us to have a region that can allow life. And there's untold trillions of galaxies. You've seen in just a few of the pictures that I've shown. That's like a pinprick of the sky, and you saw how many galaxies there were. But this is what they call the Goldilocks zone, and it's this precise location that makes life possible. And this is an artist's depiction of what the Milky Way galaxy looks like. You can see our sun. We're on what they call the Orion Spur. That's the Orion constellation. You can see Perseus and Sagittarius. You can kind of see where these stars that make up the constellations we see in the sky fall relative to us. And what I think is so amazing, that out of the vastness of the sky and all these galaxies, this specific region on this specific galaxy has everything that you need so that you could have life, right? It's important for the planet formation and some other things. Now, scientists have discovered other galaxies where they think there might be these type of zones, but they don't know. There could be, and actually, one thing I think as Christians we should think about is, okay, you'll hear a lot on the news about ET, extraterrestrials, life from outer space. Is there anything in the Bible that would be challenged if that was true? No, exactly the right answer. In fact, God never told us we were alone in space. Now, we very well, I tend to believe we are, but our faith shouldn't be impacted by that in any way. I actually saw a really funny cartoon. I wish I'd put it up, and it shows this little green man coming in a space, a little flying saucer, and he lands, and this guy's all shocked, right? And he comes up and talks to him, and the first thing the guy does is, he's a Christian. It's like, I'm a Christian. It's like, oh, you know Jesus, this little green man. It's like, yeah, and the Christian's all shocked. It's like, how do you know Jesus? And it's like, well, he comes every Wednesday. It's like, what did you guys do when he showed up? So we have pizza, It's like, so it's like, I think we so easy think that those type of things would rock the foundation of our faith, and they really don't. What God promised us, He made everything, and He made us in His image, and He made us to have a relationship with Him. Other things in the universe are not biblically laid out, and we shouldn't let any of that sort of thing rock our faith. And I don't know what will come in the future, but just a little aside, because I thought that cartoon was so funny. So let me let J. Warner Wallace describe this in a little more articulate way.
The actual fine-tuning of gravity is so strictly constrained that if we had a tape measure and spanned the entire known universe, we just stretched it out from as far as we can see, as far as we know in either direction, that's a long tape measure. Well, if we just varied the force of gravity by 1 inch on that incredibly long tape measure, we would not have a universe right now that supports itself, let alone life. That's how finely tuned gravity is, and every other cosmological constant is equally fine-tuned. At the regional level, we have just the right galaxy and solar system is fine-tuned to support life. Our galaxy is the right size, it's the right shape, it's the right distance from other galaxies. We are at the right position in the spiral arm of that galaxy. Our solar system, still at this regional level, is just the right size star, just the right composition, just the right mass, just the right heat. Even at the regional level of evidence here, we see fine-tuning.
Yeah, J. Warner Wallace, guys, I like his images. He's pretty funny. When he was in high school, he was in an art school. He said, Doug, one thing 9 years of art school did for me is I can illustrate my own books. So all those illustrations are actually his. He became a
high school and college.
Was it college? I thought it was. I thought it was high
Yes, degree. He has a degree.
He's architect. His college. He tried to be an architect and couldn't make
No, he has a
money.
master in architecture and art degree.
Oh, undergraduate art degree. It says
Yes.
9 years though. I know he says 9 years of
plus
art.
masters.
Okay. So, but he illustrates his own books, which is good. But he also puts it in language that it's kind of the language that most people speak in. So does that any questions about the first two levels? It's somewhat a lot of numbers, and so let's look at the solar system. The solar system level, we're talking about the planets, and our solar system is very amazing. I'm going to let William Lane Craig talk with you for a little bit, and then we'll chat about the complexities. Well, maybe not. I'll look at the picture for a second. I think if you're not familiar with the way our solar system is set up, it has got an incredibly fine design. You have these gas giants on the outside, which are like vacuum cleaners. They collect every odd little bit of trash that comes into our solar system from the galaxy. Because of their gravitational force, almost nothing can get through. And then you see there's asteroid belts that protect the inner planets. And in fact, the other inner planets help Earth to stay in its orbit, so it's in a habitable range. Another interesting thing, like I said, I'll play the William Lane Craig's video first, but I want you to think as they talk through this, why is our solar system flat? Well, everything basically orbits. That's the reason when you look in the night sky, you can pick the planets up because they're always in a line, right? There's a little bit of complexity to that.
Not only
What? Go ahead.
the picture you've got right there with them all in a line. No, they're all on their orbits. I believe that, but that.
Oh no, that's disingenuous for sure.
Not right. They're here and here and here and here.
Oh yeah, I couldn't put them all on the page if this is an artist depiction,
Okay.
and it's not to scale either. Jupiter's like. Well, interesting thing, Alexa, Frank Turek is the one I'm going to play next. What's interesting about the planets is they all spin at different rates. They all have a different tilt to them. And in fact, they don't all spin on the axis of the solar system. Uranus, which is the bluish one, actually spins the opposite direction. Earth spins this way, Uranus spins this way. They still don't have any clue why that is, because it kind of causes problems with the formation theories. And Laura is absolutely right. They're not all in circular orbits, and they're not all exactly in the same.
She's a star and planet person right there.
Yeah, but the one that always kills them is comets. Yeah, how does a comet factor in? Because they're part of the solar system, right? And they don't follow any of these orbital rules. And we still have comets, even though our solar system is billions of years old, that's for another story.
Not only is the universe designed in this way, our solar system appears to be designed with us in mind. Let's take a look at the solar system here for a minute. Stay awake, stay awake. Here we are, third rock from the sun. If we were just a little bit closer to her, a little bit further away, we couldn't survive. A little bit closer to, we'd burn up. A little bit further away, we'd freeze. We are in what scientists call the Goldilocks zone. It's not too hot, it's not too cold, it is, that's a lie, it's too hot here in the summer. The axial tilt, 23.5 degrees, change that slightly, we don't exist. Earth rotation, 24 hours, change that slightly, we don't exist. The size and distance of the moon from us, change that slightly, we don't exist. If Jupiter was not in its current orbit, we couldn't exist here. Why not? Because Jupiter is a cosmic vacuum cleaner. Its gravitational force is so strong that it attracts most of the meteors and space junk to it rather than us.
Lost the audio. He's showing an impact crater on Jupiter that's bigger than the size of the Earth. And most of the spots on Jupiter actually correspond to impacts from meteors. I don't know what happened to our audio. I'll skip forward. Anyway, Frank kind of misspoke himself. We call it the habitable zone. The Goldilocks zone is actually at the galactic level. Inside the solar system, the region that is habitable or that life can exist is really narrow. And if you look at our solar system in this graphic, you see that there's only one planet in our solar system that actually falls into the habitable zone. They've been trying to stretch it to Mars in recent years by redefining what's habitable. I don't want to go to Mars. I don't think, you think it's cold? No, thank you. So, but the point of the solar system model is the fact that everything has to be exactly how it is, or Earth would not be the way it is. And the really remarkable thing is why the solar system is shaped the way it is. It doesn't make any sense that we're basically a disk. And because the spins are different speeds and different axes, most of the models that always show this gravitational force kind of fluctuating, and that's how the planets build. That's how I learned it in school, that you had this dust cloud and they kind of came together, and the model doesn't really work scientifically. It sounds really good when you're telling it to high school kids, but it actually scientifically, it doesn't work real good. There are a lot of forces that we don't understand that result in what we have that don't really make sense based on the science. There has to have been some sort of force that we're not aware of. That's what the scientists will tell you. There's some force that we're not aware of that gave rise to this or to that. Well, we know what that force that gave rise to it is. That's the God force. It wasn't just time. Time wouldn't help you. Randomness doesn't help you. There has to be some intelligent design to make a detailed design that is so complex. And that's what you just keep seeing. So let's look at the next layer, and it starts getting more interesting as we get closer to us. This is our local level, the planet Earth. And planet Earth is, and this is just a picture from space. Our planet is so incredibly amazing that I don't think we always take it. It spins at exactly the right speed. Do you know how fast you're moving right now?
Not very fast.
What is it? I think it's is it 67,000 miles an hour?
Faster than the speed of the bullet.
Yes, and you don't even notice it.
Don't feel it.
And we're spinning. Yeah, I don't know. I'd have to do the calculation, but it's six. Yeah, yet you're moving 67,000 miles an hour around the sun, and the water just doesn't go pouring out into space. The air stays. I mean, and science will tell you we understand all this, but they actually don't understand why our atmosphere stays the way it does. It has to do with the magnetic fields, and there's all these other forces which are very precise, because if they were any stronger, the atmosphere would collapse. If they were any weaker, the atmosphere would go away.
You think that they would convince themselves that there's a higher being, that there is a God, when they sit and think about all of those aspects together, the spinning, the solar system, everything, somebody's got to put it together.
It's intentional denial.
Yeah.
It really is. What you'll hear often is this idea that I don't know what it is, but it can't be God. Because God's impossible. It's not necessary. You heard that from Lawrence Krauss in one of the videos we had earlier in the sessions. It's this idea that I don't need God. I can come up with science that explains all of this. It's like, but you haven't. It's like, you give us enough time, we'll scientifically come up with an explanation. Like, okay, science hasn't done it yet. And in fact, the more science we get, the further away we get from an explanation. And the concentration of oxygen, the fact that our crust is the right thickness, the right compositions for organic life, water, which is such an amazing element. We take it for granted, but without that, there is no life on Earth. And so I'm going to again let William Wallace tell you in his more. J. Warner Wallace, sorry. My tongue is not always good, and today's one of those days. And this is J. Warner Wallace explaining the fine-tuned aspects of Earth.
Not only that, at the local level of our planet Earth, it's just the right size, just the right terrestrial depth of our crust of our planet to allow for the tectonic movement of plates, just the right atmospheric conditions. We happen to have a moon of the right size that is not so overbearing that it stops the rotation of Earth, but it allows the kinds of seasons we see in our planet, the kind of tides we see in our planet. All of this is fine-tuned.
All right. So I know that's the short version of a very long talk that he gives. Any questions about the fine-tuning aspects before we get into life? And then I won't really get into evolution in detail today, although I'll probably make some side comments, but why don't we take a quick break and we'll come back and look at the incredible design that life is. Okay, so we're going to start our last two levels of design, starting with life. And everyone knows this is the one that gets talked about the most in our culture. You'll hear origin to life, you'll hear evolution, you'll hear a lot of the words that, they basically prove that they can make life and all these type of things. This is effectively what Darwin thought the cell looked like. This is all he had to work with. He thought the cell was basically a bag of cytoplasm and a nucleus. You could, even in his day, you could see with microscopes cells doing mitosis, which is the splitting. They could even see the nucleus and the chromosomes inside. But he believed it was basically just a sack of. And he has this quote in Origin of the Species. This is his famous book, and he says, "If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down." So that's what he said about his own theory. This is a very simple model of a normal cell in our body. And you can tell it's kind of complex. I won't go into the details, but if you were to remove any one of those components from this living cell, the cell would either die immediately or it wouldn't be viable, which means it would starve to death. There's no component of a human cell that you can remove and still maintain viability as far as a whole component. So there's no pathway to modified single steps. You have to have everything or nothing. And that's just the big, our animal cells, so cells like in our body. And I look at this and what we know from science. And when we do the science session in a couple of weeks, I'm going to show some, they have done animations of what goes on in the cell based on what we know. They can see it in an electron microscope, but what they've done is done animations to try to show it to high school kids and college kids. This is right out of science classes, so it's not Christian. And when you see it, if you don't see God, you're just hardened to the complexity, because it's just amazing how these things inside our cells move around. But they don't move around randomly. They move around with purpose. There are certain proteins that attach themselves to the chromosomes when a certain thing needs to be made because there's something else that they've sent someplace else in the body. How our body knows how to do these things, we simply don't know. Physiology and anatomy and microbiology give us some insight on what it does, but why and how it does is just amazing. So very complex. So the first thing to think, okay, so that's the animal cells. Those are complex, right? Well, let's look at a plant cell. The plant cell, frankly, plant cells are more complex than animal cells. We have bones and muscles. The cell wall is amazing. Without the cell wall, there's no structure to a plant. All plants would collapse. So you can't have that evolve into plane. And if there wasn't chloroplast, the plant couldn't get any energy. It has to have chloroplast. But how did chloroplast come about? I mean, that's how it takes sun and then makes energy. And I think in terms of high school biology, this is what I learned in high school biology. Consumers and producers. A consumer is something that consumes, and a producer is something that produces. So which came first in the evolutionary model? Tough question. There's not an answer. Photosynthesis is the common way that producers make energy. Now there are other methods. There's one called chemosynthesis, which is, it's only found in the anthropic region of the sea, which is way at the bottom when there's no sunlight. And it only happens around volcanic vents. But there's no relation to what there is on the surface to what's happening underwater. And the evolutionists try to ignore the chemosynthesis because it really makes it complicated to imagine how any living organism would start on the surface and ever get there and then change its method of generating energy from nothing. So the very fact that there are alternatives to photosynthesis make it even more complex. That how do we do this? What's the perfect balance? Can any of these components be derived step by step? Because if I'm a producer, okay, so I can produce my own energy. So how did I become a cell and then become a producer? Which came first, the producing or the cell? Well, you can't have a producer if there's not already a cell. So it's this circular logic. It's okay, what is the component that could start that would result in eventually getting to life? And I look at this photosynthesis model, and this is just out of a biology textbook, and it's incredibly amazing is what it is, that sunlight comes down and the plant absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and some minerals from the ground and then generates oxygen and sugars that you and I can actually eat. I mean, it's amazing. The cycle of life and how chloroplast works is just, and it's incredibly complex. And like I said, come back for when we do the science versus naturalism, a couple of sessions, and I'll show you some animations of the chloroplast, which will blow you away if you've never seen it. So most naturalists would say, well, these are complex organisms. Obviously, this is not what we started with in their model, right? So like, okay, let's talk about something simpler. Well, one of the simplest single-cell organisms is the amoeba. And that's what an amoeba looks like under a microscope. And the Darwin level of scientist, when he came up with this theory, it looked like this. It's just a blob. You see the nucleus in the middle. It looked like there's no complexity to it at all. So this is their link. Well, we know now that an amoeba is pretty complex. It has a lot of components inside of it that without any one of the components, it fails to survive. I mean, how would it take in food particles? And again, where's the food particles coming from for the simple organism? Because there has to be a producer someplace to make the food particle. These are organic compounds that have to be made inside living cells. They don't happen outside of living cells. And that's kind of one of the secrets that people don't ever tell you about evolution is the chemistry that happens inside a living cell can only happen inside a living cell. It can't be reproduced outside of a living organism because of the way the chemistry works. It has to branch these huge, long molecules have to have shape. Shape is what gives life its specificity. And without that shape, it just doesn't work. And when we do it outside of the cell, for some reason, we can't reproduce the shapes. We just cannot. So, okay, the evolution is like, okay, so that's a single cell animal type creature, right? An amoeba. What's simpler than an amoeba? Can you think of anything? What about bacteria? So some people say, well, bacteria was the first form of life. And this is E. coli. I think this is E. coli. Is that E. coli? Yeah, it's E. coli. It's in your stomach right now. E. coli, right? And it looks pretty, not very, it just looks like a big blob. Yeah, Cheetos, right? And modern science has changed the way we look at bacteria. Because up until the last, maybe 40 years, this is what we knew of bacteria. This is what that bacteria really looks like. It has, a nucleoid inside, it's got cytoplasm, but the amazing thing is what's on the outside of the bacteria. And we'll just look at the flagella for a second. That's how the bacteria moves around, right? Is this amazing device. This is what it looks like. It's made up of 29 very unique proteins that have specific features and characteristics. It's just like a modern rotary motor. We didn't discover rotary motors until, what, the 1960s or 70s, I think it was. And every bacteria had already had one of these from God's creation. We're just catching up. If you remove any one of those proteins, the device doesn't work. And they've tried. E. coli is one of the most tested bacteria. They've been trying to induce mutations in E. coli bacteria since, you probably know better than I do, Annie, this is more of a medical thing, but it's like since the 50s. I mean, millions and millions and millions of mutations have been forced on E. coli, and what we discovered is mutations always result in less information, never more information. And mutations result in either death of the subject or loss of viability, which means it can't reproduce. So evolution says those mutations should lead us to new information and new function, but despite a very focused effort that has gone on for more than 50 years, they have failed to achieve even one slightly modification that would be considered new information. It's always been less. And I think the complexity of the flagella is just amazing. You look at, it looks like a rotary motor if you look at the bits and pieces. Yet this is a biological system and one of the simplest organisms on Earth. And the organism is, we think of it as simple. It's a simple one-cell organism, but look at the complexity of just one component of that bacteria. And in fact, it has several different components that have that kind of complexity. It has something called a injectosome, which is how it injects into its whatever it's going to symbiotically work off of. And there are several components on something as simple as an E. coli bacteria that have multiple parts. I mean, dozens of parts that are necessary or it doesn't work. And in fact, any one of those proteins was not there, the bacteria itself would either not reproduce or it would die because it couldn't feed itself. And so where is the stepwise evolution that we always hear about? Any component is missing, it just simply doesn't work. Not to mention, you can't see a progression of components. You can't see where, oh, this could potentially have turned into that. They kind of look the same in this picture, but what you see is that actual proteins are not the same. They look similar, but they have totally different functions. And they've tried to do substitution, on the molecular level to see if they could muck with these components. It always fails. It always either kills the bacteria or it makes the device that they're trying to muck around with not work. So again, this is Darwin's own words coming back to haunt him. These cannot be broken down into simpler parts. We cannot imagine any stepwise evolution that would lead to more order. Everything that we do always points toward less order. And so again, it points toward a designer. I mean, I look at the rotary motor on the flagella and I'm like, accidentally this came into being. How? I mean, how? I mean, this is a model that humans came up with for their own machinery. And if we saw the machine if you run across an engine in the middle of the forest, would you think it just came into being because it sat there for 1 million years? Or you think someone actually built it and put it there? Yet we see this on the microscopic level where we can't even do this, and we think that it happened randomly by chance. That's the frustration I think that Christians have with science is you talk nonsense because you think it sounds better than the concept of God, when the complexity is far beyond our ability to design and make, yet we think it's randomness. Go ahead, Jude.
Well, why is the Christian Scientist not point this out to those people that believe that it just wasn't just like that? And go back to Darwin. This is what Darwin said. So he's debunked. So why can't we?
The Discovery Institute talks about this a little bit, but they are attacked by the scientific community. Look at James Tour here at Rice University. He came out against.
But you still
origin of life, but they're scared because their livelihoods are at risk. And most people are yep, the funding. Well, James Tour, I don't know if you know him, he's here at Rice, and he's been
See, the problem
out.
with that is you don't trust God.
Well, he's kind of my,
Protect you or take care of you.
I would call James Tour a hero because of the last maybe, was it been 5 years he's been in this fight?
10.
He was asked to comment on an origin of life paper because he's an organic chemist. That's what he does. And he looked at it and said, well, this is all crap. He's a Jewish Christian, okay? So he just says what's on his heart, right? Boom. He says, this is all crap, and pointed all the ways it was total crap what they were saying. And the establishment went after him, personally trying to
Actually,
discredit
even
him.
as that, not as hard as that. He just said that this needs more scientific testing because it's not clear.
Well, what they were presenting was not,
It's more.
it wasn't true.
Yes,
How's that?
It's not as what you guys are saying. It needs more study.
Yeah, he never say that it couldn't be discovered. He says, man, it's possible that humans could discover the origins of life. It's possible. I say it's impossible. He says it's possible because he's a research scientist, and he says nothing can be said to be impossible. You can only say that we aren't there yet. But they attacked him. They tried to discredit him. He had trouble getting funding. He had groups tell him, don't bother even putting proposals in. You're going to be defunded. He's the head of the National Science Foundation today, and he controls the purse strings. That's how God works.
It just happened.
It just happened. This is very recent. And he'll be very fair because he's a Christian and he believes God's approach is his approach. But so not very many stand up because they think they're going to get canceled in our society. A lot know it. I mean, the Discovery Institute sometimes comes out with things and then they get hammered by
That's true. Behe got hammered.
Behe, Stephen Meyer, J.P. Moreland. They're all part of the Discovery. Well, Behe, he always tries to explain the complexity of things and how it can only come from a designer. And I think this is the quintessential part of life is DNA. We always hear about DNA this, DNA that. And let me find myself on my notes. So DNA is an incredibly complex component of life, obviously. It's about 4.5 billion letters put together in a very precise order to make up the word effectively that creates us. And 4.5 billion is kind of a big number, but it's a, well, let me give you a little example of what 4.5 billion looks like. So this is one of my favorite Bibles. This is a comparative Bible. It has NIV, which is a nice reading Bible. King James, pretty. New American Standard, which tries to do word-for-word accuracy, not very well, but they do their best. And Amplified, which is kind of a semi-paraphrased Bible. And they're all in parallel. I don't know if you can notice, it's really small print. Yes. So there is roughly 3,000 characters on each page in this book. And this book is about 3,000 pages long. So there's about 10 million characters in this book. So if I was to compare it to DNA, and I was to put this book on the ground, and I was to stack books just like it all the way to the ceiling, I would have to make 4 stacks to even come close. Does that kind of put it in perspective? I mean, I'm talking that ceiling, not this one. About 80 feet of book is about what 4.5 billion characters looks like. So it's a lot of information.
Yeah, and what I understand is they don't even know everything about our DNA yet. Like there's stuff that they don't even know where it came from or what it is.
Well, and DNA is not the whole story. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to just kind of, they talk about randomness, right? So I have a really simple name. 3 characters. DNA only has 4 characters in it, right? So could I toss this pin at that and ever make my name? No. Maybe my daughter could, I don't know. But you know, the evolution approach is that this is a bottle of ink, and that somehow I could throw it enough times and eventually my name would show up. Except my name is 4.5 billion characters long instead of 3. I mean, that's the evolutionary idea, is somehow they think time. If I do this enough, it's just going to happen. And it's not rational, but that's what we allow them to get by with. They'll say, oh, you're using God of gaps because you don't understand how it happened. Well, they use time of the gaps and saying time isn't working for them. Every component that makes up DNA, when it is in its purest form, it doesn't last very long. It decomposes very quickly. Most of these are seconds, some of them are minutes, a few maybe days. To get all the components together in a non-living organism, they simply don't last long enough for them to ever combine together. Not to mention they can't combine like this outside of a living organism. The DNA is this double helix structure. It's like I think it's 3-5 prime is how I'm sorry, I don't want to talk chemistry, but the way the branches on the RNA have to form in this specific locations on the molecule for them to form this shape. And the shape is really critical to life. Outside of a living organism, that is not the way the chemistry works. So we can't reproduce this. In fact, they can't reproduce it outside of a living organism. When they try to reproduce DNA, even from the purest components, they get this jumble of stuff. They might get some of this, but there's no evidence that they actually have. And the purity is always a problem. And to put it kind of in context, I like this quote from Bill Gates, software guy, says, DNA is like a computer program, but far more advanced than any software ever created. But we think software is created by somebody. This is Bill Gates, who is definitely not a Christian, essentially saying that there's no possible random solution for something that's so complex. And you're absolutely right. DNA is not the whole picture. In fact, DNA replication, and this is a very simplistic diagram, you have to have all these different components to do anything with DNA. You have the DNA primus, the RNA primer, the DNA ligase, the DNA polymerase, all these different components. These are not part of DNA. In fact, DNA doesn't even make these. These are made someplace else in the cell. But without these, DNA is nothing. In fact, these proteins are even more complex than DNA themselves. They have 3-dimensional shape. And these are the best artist conceptions that I could find. These different components that are necessary for just the replication of DNA are amazingly more complex. And there's information in these as well. We don't even have any clue. The shape actually is like a message, and when it attaches itself to the RNA or the DNA, it triggers a different component to take place. And they don't understand. I don't understand. I can see it, and you can see how beautiful it is, but there's the same stretch of DNA it's got 4 letters, right? What if I change one of the letters out of a 4-letter word? In English, that changes it a lot. If you have the right protein, you still produce the right protein. Even if you have one letter wrong, how's that possible? We don't understand. DNA is only part of the picture, yet it is 4.5 billion characters long, and it is not even close to the complexity inside the cell. And I know you guys don't want organic chemistry lessons, so I'll kind of stop at that, but there's a lot more to the picture. And I think from the Christian perspective, the creation perspective, which one of those components can you take away and have a viable cell? This is just replication of DNA. This is not all the other activities that happen inside the cell. If you take any one of those components away, it simply doesn't work. So how do you get to what Darwin said? If you could ever prove that there was any component that could not be sequentially modified into a more ordered, well, I can't do that. I can't take a step backwards, I can't take a step forwards without killing the organism itself. Any questions? Like I said, I don't want to get too much into this.
What you're saying is you need everything for everything to be produced. Darwin was saying is there's this piece first came out, and then there's another one that came out, and then they mixed together, and then it became voila, it become an organism. But science was saying that everything needs to be there to start with at the same time.
In incredibly pure quantities. The other thing we also don't understand, a living cell has this ability to let the good stuff in and leave the bad stuff on the outside. If these chemicals are not in pure form, I mean like ultra pure form, the chemistry doesn't work. They don't ever fold back on each other and even form into these three-dimensional shapes.
Like B's example, the mousetrap. You have all the parts of the mousetrap, but you need to have all the components to make a mousetrap. If you don't have all the components, you cannot make a mousetrap. It's just right there. It's not going to be a mousetrap.
I have his short video, and I'm going to show it when we do naturalism versus creationism, where he uses a mousetrap, which only has like 7 components as his basis. It's like, take any one of those away, and can you catch a mouse? No. You got a good paperweight maybe, but it's not designed to be a paperweight. And I think we allow ourselves to be steamrolled by scientists like myself. I got PhD, and I tell you that this could all happen in this stepwise process. But how? I mean, they've never demonstrated a mechanism that actually can do it. They've never actually done it. And that's really what the origin of life research is all about. And that's the reason we have groups like the Discovery Institute or James Tour that are trying to address those concepts. And it's not to say you could not discover it, but as of today, there's no science to back up the claims of being able to create a cell. And I watch science news all the time because I'm a science geek. And they're always talking about, oh, we have proved life, blah, 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 or we built life. Or it's like, and you look at it and it's like, okay, you came up with some amino acids and they're not even the right ones. And somehow that's going to be life. And then it goes away for, people win their Nobel Prize and then nothing happens. So that's life. And this is Stephen Meyer and James Tour, if you don't know him. James Tour is down here at Rice University. And Stephen Meyer is at the Discovery Institute with Behe and J.P. Moreland, who J.P. Moreland, I think I showed a video of him early on, and we'll see one from Behe later. But the Discovery Institute basically tries to address intelligent design arguments, basically arguments for God, looking at what we've looked at and showing how only an intelligent design makes sense. It's the only rational way to look at the complexity, that there has to have been a force driving that design. And even if you believe in evolution, again, there has to be an intelligent design driving the evolution, because it doesn't happen randomly and there's no sequence, there's no mechanism for what we see in the complexity of living organisms, unless, I can't say that God didn't use evolution. I'm not God, so I can't say how he did it. Some people say 6-day creation, some people say 6 billion year creation. I'm not going to get into the story. I say God created it. And without God, nothing could be the way it is today. And the key is God did. And me as a human, I have no idea other than he said he spoke it and I trust him and that's it. And that's what these guys focus on. So if you want more information, these are the guys to look up.
Creation Museum, is that the one that's your...
Creation Museum would be Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis group.
Right, that's in Kentucky.
Actually, the Creation Museum is in Ohio. The Ark Encounter is in Kentucky. They're really close to each other. And yeah, the they go through a lot of that. That's not the same organization. He's more focused on, well, I mean, they're trying to show how the Genesis story matches what we have. That's what his group works on. Where like Stephen Meyer's group is really trying to counter the origin of life researchers in a way that pointing it toward, this all points toward intelligent design, and not necessarily trying to win them to Christianity more than show the holes in their theories. Because when someone's this far from God, you can't use Genesis to prove to them there's a God. You just can't. You have to prove to them there is a God, and then you can use Genesis to point them to the right God. And what we've been talking about is really just to point people to God, because right now people that are a long ways from God don't care what the Bible says. And I hope you guys have noticed that so far we haven't used hardly any Bible in any of these sessions, and that is by design. We're going to talk about the Bible. You can prove that there's incredibly good arguments for God without ever looking at the Bible. The Bible gives us our wisdom, and there's a stage where the Bible is necessary, but you've got to get people so they're open to it. And part of it is showing them this overwhelming amount of evidence for there has to be a God. Then we can start talking about which God. But I think as you go through the different levels of creation, like we did today, you can see that every single level, the complexity and the fingerprints of God are all over it, right? I mean, there's no simple form. And the last one I wanted to talk about is subatomics. And I'm sorry, I'm an engineer, okay? So I did take theory of relativity and quantum mechanics and all this crazy stuff. So this is a carbon molecule, or atom. You guys might remember this from high school or college chemistry. There's not a scientist in the world that could explain to you why that is the way it is. I mean, for starters, the black dots are electrons. They're all negative charged, right? And they're spinning around. Why don't they come crashing into the center, which is positively charged with protons, right? And protons are positively charged. You take two positive magnets and you try to push them together. Why does the nucleus stay together when they're all the same poles of a... And that's your strong and weak nuclear forces, right? It's very tough to... We know we can calculate the nuclear forces that make it possible, but we can't explain why it's possible. That's the difference between able to observe the world and say, oh, God did something amazing here, and this is the effect, but we don't understand the how. And I'm guessing that most of you think these are the building blocks of everything in the universe. Protons, neutrons, electrons. Is that kind of where you guys' science stops? Well, I can tell you that's not a complete story. We now have what they call quarks. There are, I think, 8 different kinds of quarks. And different combination of quarks is what makes up a proton, a neutron, and an electron. Part of the reasons protons, neutrons, and electrons are not all the same, believe it or not. It gets more complex as you get smaller. We started with 3 components, now we have 8 components. And as you get smaller, it gets a little complicated. You know, another thing that points toward design is things like light. We take light for granted, but do you ever wonder why when light comes through a window, it separates into a rainbow? So there's like different kinds of light inside one kind of light. This is wavelengths, right? Did you know light has weight? Light has weight. This is one of the things the scientists are really struggling with these new telescopes, because they can actually see light bending around galaxies because of the gravitational force of the galaxy on the light. Yeah, it's kind of that's what the astrophysicists say. So as we get smaller down to something as simple as a photon, it gets more complicated, and we have no idea. And in fact, that's really kind of just the beginning. We have things like gamma rays and microwaves, and they can make physical impact on us. We use them for cancer treatments. We use them for x-rays to see broken bones. Why is that? those subatomic, which are even beyond subatomic components, I'll call them particles because everything's particles, are incredibly complex. And there's amazing design in them. And then we have the new science. I call it the new science generously because it's like, I think our scientists are running out of terms, so we start turning to science fiction every time we come up with an idea, and they talk in terms of things like tachyons. Anybody remember tachyon from your childhood? Yeah, it's Star Trek. And scientists now have this hypothetical particle that's even smaller than a quark called a tachyon. It's from Star Trek. And another one from Star Trek is the neutrino. Neutrino is somehow a neutral particle with all that complexity that they're trying to show you. You can't actually see these things. This is all theoretical. But one thing you notice in their depictions of these simple particles, they look kind of complex. So even the scientists who aren't trying to prove God, obviously, as they can imagine things that are more basic, it starts looking more complex. It kind of moves the opposite way from the idea that you could have something simpler as your building block. And then probably kind of the craziest is the string theory. The string theory is the idea that everything's made out of these like infinitesimal strings. It's like everything. You can't see it, can't test it, but you notice when they depict it, it's like this wild array of complexity. So as they get smaller and smaller in their perceptions, they actually make the world more and more complex. And the last one's dark matter. You'll hear a lot about this one lately. I even saw it in one of the videos I showed you where they're talking about dark matter as part of the original creation. Nobody knows anything about dark matter. Dark matter is a make-believe idea that came out of the multiverse comics. Okay, that's where that term comes from. They also have something called dark energy now. So you have dark energy and dark matter, and it's just, when they look out into outer space, you see this black vastness. And they have to explain that that empty space is not really empty. And that's where these kind of theories come from, because it's not really empty. We perceive it as empty, but there are things that we can't perceive that are there. That empty space has a weight. We don't understand why it has a weight, but there's something there. And I think my point is, as you can imagine something smaller and smaller that makes up all of us, it actually gets more complex. It doesn't get simpler. Even the simplest thing we can imagine is actually more complex than anything we have. The theories on strings and dark matter and neutrinos and tachyons is way beyond electrons, protons, and neutrons. Seems pretty simple to me, 3 components. When you start talking about these components, you're talking about things that are, one, it's beyond anybody's comprehension because it's make-believe, right? It's only imagined. But my point is, no matter which direction you go smaller and smaller, smaller. It gets more and more complex, not simple. As you go bigger and bigger and bigger, it gets more complex, not simpler. Doesn't matter which way you go. The complexity and the fine design of everything in creation is just, it's just amazing. I mean, I get excited by the science. I know you guys aren't excited by it as I am, but design argument, I think, is the most compelling argument for God because it cannot be explained away, no matter what the pseudoscientists tell us or the evolutionists or the naturalists. They don't have an explanation. Time is not an explanation. It is an excuse. And it doesn't work. And when you talk about life, it does not work. So let's just recap our arguments a little bit. So cosmological argument, the beginning, it means whatever started everything has to be immaterial, timeless, and spaceless, outside of time, space, and matter, right? If it's the beginning. It's got to be extremely powerful to bring everything into existence from nothing. Something from nothing, right? Teleological, that's the design that we just went through. Extremely intelligent, whatever that force is that created everything. It has to be able to sustain creation, because one thing we've noticed, There's all these constants that have to be precise. It's like there's a force out there behind everything that maintains that stability. Stability doesn't come natural in our universe. Actually, our universe is always anti-stability. So why are those constants even constant? Well, they're constant because there's some sort of a force out there that holds things the way they are and has a purpose for them. And I didn't say it, but I probably should say it now. There are people out there right now that are challenging the constants and that they're not really constant. They really change over time. The problem with that is if you disprove scientific constants, you don't have any science. Because science presupposes that we have standards that we can compare to. So the scientists that come up with these ideas are actually disproving science, which kind of is it's one of those circular logics. How can a scientist disprove science with science? You can't, right? Science can't disprove itself because it would have to know something outside of science, and that's those circular arguments we talked about. And then obviously the moral argument, which outside of the design argument, the moral argument is really probably one of the clearest ones. And we'll talk about this more when we talk about the problem of evil. If there's no standard bearer, then there are no morals. Yet we all know when something bad happens to us. Doesn't matter what culture we come from. If you steal something from somebody, they think it's bad. You hit them in the nose, they usually think it's bad. That's independent of how you grew up, what you grew up.
You feel bad about it.
And you feel bad about it.
Why don't you just forgive yourself? Like, don't feel bad.
Well, Jordan Peterson is one of those. He's a psychologist
Forgive
from
yourself.
Canada. He says,
People never get by with anything because they can never forgive themselves. Doesn't matter what you've done, it always eats at you. Why is that? And he said from his psychological practice, he sees that. People never can forgive themselves because we're not capable of forgiving ourselves. Only God can forgive us. The only time we really feel forgiven is when God does it. We can't forgive ourselves. And that, again, points toward a moral lawgiver, or, you know, that morally perfect being, which makes it personal. And that's our God, is personal. All these are the components which together make the cumulative case, and the fingerprints of God are all over. Let me leave you with one quote and then I'll let you get out of here. I know you have to go, Laura. This is Robert, I can't say his Jastrow. He was the head of the Goddard Space Institute. He was one of the lead scientists on the Apollo missions way back in the day. And he said this: "For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak, and as he pulls himself over the last and final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries." And that's really where science comes to. We eventually come back to exactly what God always told us in the beginning. And I'll kind of leave you with that. Let's go ahead and, is there a God? Well, obviously, yes. Next week we'll talk about the problem of evil. Which is not really a problem, it's really our perspective on it that's the problem. And then I want to close with a song by Rich Mullins. You know Rich Mullins? Ever heard Awesome God? This is kind of one of my favorite songs. All right, let's be pray real quick and then I'll let you guys get out of here. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for you. Thank you for all the evidence that points us to you so that we can be confident in what we believe. We don't believe in blind faith. We believe in the evidence that points us to a faith in you. And thank you so much for everyone who came today so that we could talk about this amazing, amazing universe that you have gifted us with, and the complexity to challenge our brains and show us that there's really only one truth, and that truth is you. I pray all these things in your name, Lord Jesus. Amen.